Finally, I suggest that pluralism is important. What do I mean by this? A working democracy needs to have at least a basic level of support for pluralism, by which it must be willing to accept the opinions, views, and existence of religious and ethnic minorities as valid. This leads me to question, we'll talk about this possibly in question and answer, whether some countries in the Middle East, some particular countries, can have working democracies. I do not think that Islam is fundamentally opposed to democracy. I question whether or not Islamism, or one might call particular strands of radical Islam, or jihadism is. This is a real problem, given that election results in some countries in the Middle East suggest that a substantial portion of the population, perhaps a substantial majority, does not subscribe to any sort of willingness to be pluralist in a society. That is, if we look at Egypt, for example, 75% of the vote was won by generally Islamist parties. Now, they may turn out to moderate in governance, and they may not. We're going to find out. But whether or not you can have an actual working democracy in a country where most of the people do not have any respect for minority views is a difficult question. Okay, so here are 5 things that are arguably any working democracy must have. At the same time, there are a number of things that a democracy may or may not have. Every democracy is not going to have the same kind of constitution. A democracy could have a prime minister instead of a president, a unicameral legislature, that is a one-house legislature rather than a bicameral or two-house legislature. This is a bit of a long-winded way of saying that a democracy requires a healthy respect for the law, a primacy of personal rights and liberties, a legitimately elected government, and an active citizenry. In the United States, we generally have a very healthy respect for the law, my speed limit examples notwithstanding. We also have a healthy respect for rights, so much so that a great deal of our political life is arguing over how fairly and how widespread those rights are. We are also governed by individuals that we choose. However, not very many of us are engaged in the choosing. Democratic participation and engagement in America is lousy. For example, even in a highly contested presidential primary, I've already mentioned this, only 41% of registered Republicans turned out to vote in Florida's primary this week. In the 1960s, 65% of the public voted, which is really high compared to today, but quite frankly not that good in the first place. 51% voted in 2000, and just 39% voted in 2002. Only 18% voted in congressional primaries. This is what turnout in America is. In general, there is less voting and less willingness to pay attention to politics. Why? Why are political participation and engagement down? Thomas Patterson suggests that the reason partly is that political parties have changed. What does he mean by this? Before the New Deal, there were really big divides between the parties on basic economic issues. Patterson suggests that after the New Deal, much of that has been resolved since a safety net in terms of Social Security and Medicare, for example, was in place. Those comprehensive economic justice issues were replaced by a larger set of less comprehensive and more partisan, more issues that were divided between parties. That is, the parties did not all agree. One party did not all agree on one side or the other of the issue. Issues like civil rights, crime, school prayer, abortion, education, which divided the Republican Party and Democratic Party in less clear-cut ways. As part of this, the number of independents increased, and the public had a less clear view of what the parties believed. This is relevant because Americans who have a clear party loyalty, that is, who are strong Republicans or strong Democrats, vote twice as much as Americans who identify as independents. It's not a bad thing to be an independent, but in general, from a political scientist's perspective, someone who says they're an independent, what that often means is they're unengaged. Right? Not always. If you're an independent, don't take offense. But in general, independent is shorthand for saying something kind of like, I'm agnostic, which means, in practical terms, I don't care one way or another and probably won't bother to vote. Not always, but in general, independents vote at a much lower level. I disagree with Patterson on this point, at least in part. I think that the rise in independence is an important factor in lower turnout, but it's not because the issues in American politics are any less grand or any less divisive. I think the rise in independence is a symptom of a greater issue. That is the fact that a rising number of Americans hate politics. Why? At least partly because of the rise of negative campaigning. This is an argument of many political scientists. Perhaps this is true. We'll see if technology works here. I want to show you a short clip and ask how much it is really true that campaigns are more negative than they used to be.
Some political watchers are saying this could be the nastiest, most negative election season of all time.
This campaign season seems like candidates have taken dirty to a whole new level.
When pundits start shouting and politicians start calling each other's names, it can seem like a return to civility is not possible. Like the very idea is a relic of some bygone era.
John Adams is a blind, bald, crippled, toothless man who wants to start a war with France. While he's not busy importing mistresses from Europe, he's trying to marry one of his sons to a daughter of King George. Haven't we had enough monarchy in America?
I'm Thomas Jefferson, and I approve this message because John Adams is a hideous, hermaphroditical character with neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman.
If Thomas Jefferson wins, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries of the distressed, the soil will be soaked with blood, and the nation black with crimes. Are you prepared to see your dwellings in flames, female chastity violated, children writhing on a pike?
I'm John Adams, and I approve this message because Jefferson is the son of a half-breed Indian squaw raised on hoe cakes, and Hamilton is a Creole bastard brat of a Scotch peddler.
The nastiest, most negative election.
Candidates have taken dirty to a whole new level.
It can seem like a return to civility is not possible.
Okay. I'm not sure how much more to say about that one. Yes, so campaigns have always been negative. They've always been negative. That's not new. In fact, in some ways, they were much more personal. But just as terrible things were written, complete falsehoods about Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, we have some similar things today. One need only think about some of the terrible and false things said about Sarah Palin's son, Trig, who was born with Down syndrome. Whatever you think of Sarah Palin, there are some things that, at least in the 50s, 60s, 70s, were sort of out of bounds in politics. You didn't go after candidates' kids. That has changed. We used to do it in the 1800s, stopped doing it for a while, and now it's become much more prevalent. Beyond that, because of the nature of TV ads, campaigns can be relentlessly negative day after day. By some count, 98% of the ads in the Florida primary were negative ads. Now, that doesn't mean that all negative ads are bad. In fact, political science research shows that negative or contrast ads are often better in terms of giving factual information to voters than TV news, because TV news is primarily about horse race issues and scandals and gives very little actual information about the policies of candidates. Negative ads, on the other hand, are often sourced correctly and accurately. But the overwhelming number of them has a sort of deadening effect at a certain point. Candidates run negative ads because they work. What do you remember about the Republican primary candidates? Some of you may remember that Governor Rick Perry, before he dropped out of the race, was known as the successful governor of Texas, one of the only governors in the 50 states to keep his state in a surplus during the 2008-2009 slowdown. Most of you probably don't remember that. Right? Most of you probably remember that before he dropped out of the race, he talked about Social Security as a Ponzi scheme, and he couldn't remember in one of the debates which of the three parts of government he was going to cut as president. Right? Some of you may know that Herman Cain was a relatively successful businessman and who wanted to change the tax code to a 999 plan. I'm still not exactly sure what the 999 plan would have done. But you definitely remember all of the stories about his numerous alleged affairs. Right? Campaigning, politics has gotten more broadly negative, although, as this video showed, I think campaigns have always been negative. Second, let's see. Why is political parties have changed? The rise of negative campaigning, personality contests. If you looked at any of the debates, I'm a political scientist. I have done you a favor. I have beat my head against the wall while watching a number of the presidential primary debates so that you don't have to, so that I can tell you a little bit about them and you don't have to go through the pain and suffering of watching the same things over and over again. I can tell you what the debates were about.